January 19th, 1953. A newly inaugurated president turns away from the crowd, reaches for his wife, and kisses her. Millions are watching. Dwight Eisenhower has just taken the oath of office. But the moment America remembers is not the oath. It is the kiss. He is the first president to kiss his wife at his inauguration on camera. Mamie Eisenhower is dressed in pink. She smiles. The image travels through newspapers, newsreels, and living rooms as proof of a marriage that has endured war, travel, ambition, and public life. It is almost too carefully complete to be accidental. The Buttons have already prepared the country for this picture. "I like Ike," they say. And in the campaign literature, often in a different color and a different tone, a second slogan claims her place beside him. The Buttons are the proof that somebody had thought about how this marriage would look before the cameras ever arrived. There is no fraud in the image. The affection is real. The history inside it is not false. But history is not created by truth alone. It is created by placement, emphasis, and omission. A photograph can contain a marriage and still refuse to describe it. Because the woman in pink had spent roughly 3 years of the Second World War apart from her husband. She saw him once. She lived in Washington while he commanded in Europe, and she answered other people's questions about when he would come home. Because every September 24th, Eisenhower sent Mamie yellow roses. The date was not chosen because it appeared on a calendar of romance. By several accounts in the family record, it was the birthday of their first son, Dowd Dwight Eisenhower, the boy they called Icky. He died in childhood. For the rest of their lives, they did not discuss the loss in any meaningful way. Mamie said so herself, late in life, to her granddaughter Susan. The roses remained after the conversation disappeared. And because, decades after the war, a persistent rumor followed the marriage, that Eisenhower had been involved with Kay Summersby, the Irish woman who had served as his wartime driver. The rumor reached Mamie through the same public world in which her husband's image was being protected. She was never given the evidence to answer it. She was not allowed to examine the record, confront every witness, or force the story into a place where evidence could settle it. The picture, then, is not a lie. It is a selection. Look at the kiss. Then look at the distance behind it. Look at the roses. Look at the child whose birthday the date concealed. Look at the driver whose name could be spoken by strangers but not resolved by the people most affected by the story. This is not a story about whether the public marriage was real. It was real. The more difficult question is how a true marriage became a public story by leaving out the parts that made it difficult to explain. The inauguration is only the finished surface. To understand what it contains, you have to go backward to the day the two people in the photograph first met. San Antonio, Texas, October 1915. Mamie is 18 years old. She is visiting friends at Fort Sam Houston, a military post where a young second lieutenant named Dwight Eisenhower is serving. He is not yet a general. He is not yet the man whose name will become a political shorthand. He is an officer walking his rounds in a work uniform, carrying out the ordinary duties of an army post. Fort Sam Houston in 1915 was one of the larger military installations in the country. Texas was a border state in everything but name, and the post had been built up over decades into a small city of wooden barracks, officer quarters, parade grounds, and training fields. A second lieutenant walking his rounds in a work uniform was not a figure of romance. He was a junior officer doing the unglamorous business of an army that had not yet seen a world war, inspecting quarters, checking that order was kept, learning how a post ran from the inside. Mamie was not there for the army. She was there for the winter. The cold of Denver, where her family lived, was hard on her health, and San Antonio had become the warm season address for a particular class of American family who could afford to follow the weather. She had grown up moving between a square brick house on Lafayette Street in Denver and a winter in Texas. She knew military posts the way other young women knew boarding schools. Someone calls him over. An introduction is made. Eisenhower asks Mamie to come along with him while he finishes his inspection. She goes. The moment is unremarkable in the record and decisive in the life. It does not announce a future presidency. It does not contain a campaign slogan. There is no camera, no audience, no pink dress, no press office, no version of the marriage already arranged for public consumption. There is only an invitation. Mamie accepts it. Years later, in his memoir, Eisenhower described her as vivacious and attractive, smaller than average, saucy in the look about her face and in her whole attitude. The wording matters because it catches the first thing he noticed. Not her social position, not the money her father had made in meatpacking, not the advantages a wealthy Denver family could bring to a junior officer with almost no pay. He noticed the look about her. He noticed that she did not seem impressed by the uniform. That is the beginning. Not the kiss, not the White House, not the buttons. The beginning is a young woman joining a young officer on a walk around a military post in San Antonio. The rest of the story will be built from moments like this one. Apparently small decisions that become permanent because neither person fully understands what they are agreeing to. The first meeting will be remembered later. The inauguration will be remembered earlier in the national imagination. But chronology does not determine meaning. A country may meet a couple at the height of their public life and believe it has seen the whole marriage. The camera sees the president turning toward his wife. It does not see the road that brought him there. It does not see Fort Sam Houston in the autumn of 1915, when the Second World War was still years away, and the officer of the day was a young second lieutenant who had grown up in a small white house in Abilene, Kansas, the son of a family with no money and a strict religious mother. It does not see the young woman walking beside him, a rich girl from Denver who had been told, according to the family record, to rest 3 days a week for a childhood heart condition, and who had negotiated this down to lying in until noon. It does not see what either of them would later become, or what the country would later decide to print about them. The roses arrive every year. No one has to explain why. The public can admire the gesture without asking which loss made the date necessary. The rumor circulates. The public can repeat it without being shown anything that would prove it. The wife remains visible, but her private knowledge remains inaccessible. Every piece of the public picture is true. The picture is still wrong. Because truth can be arranged with the precision of a stage set. The most convincing version is not always the one that invents fewer facts. Sometimes it is the one that places the right facts in front of the camera and waits for the audience to mistake the frame for the world. The kiss is real. The separation is real. The roses are real. The silence around Icky is real. The unresolved story around Kay Summersby is real. The inauguration photograph does not contradict any of them. It simply keeps them from occupying the same frame. And the first frame begins in San Antonio in October 1915, with a girl of 18 accepting the offer to keep walking beside an officer she has only just met. He is not yet Dwight Eisenhower, the president. He is not yet Ike, the button, the name, the image. She is not yet Mamie Eisenhower, the woman in pink. For now they are simply two people moving together through a military post, before the country has learned how to look at them. What she was agreeing to, in that walk, was the Army. And the Army was a machine that did not consult her. San Antonio, October 1915. Mamie is 18, visiting friends at Fort Sam Houston, when an officer walking his rounds in a work uniform is introduced to her. He is Dwight Eisenhower, then a second lieutenant and the officer of the day. Someone calls him over. He asks Mamie to accompany him for the rest of his inspection. She goes. The encounter is casual. The consequences are not. In his memoir, Eisenhower later described her as vivacious and attractive, smaller than average, saucy in the look about her face and in her whole attitude. The wording matters because it catches the first thing he noticed. Not her social position, not her family money, not the advantages she could bring to an ambitious young officer. He noticed her energy. He noticed that she did not appear impressed by him. That impression would become part of the bargain. Mamie Geneva Dowd had been raised in a world of comfort. She was born in Boone, Iowa, on November 14, 1896. Her father, John Sheldon Dowd, had made his money in meatpacking. By family account, he retired at 36 and was already living as a semi-retired millionaire by 1906. Whether that retirement date is precise, the fact of the wealth is not in dispute. The family settled at 750 Lafayette Street in Denver. They wintered in San Antonio because Colorado's cold was difficult for the children. There were 4 Dowd daughters. 2 of them died young. Eleanor died in 1912 from a heart condition. Ida May died in 1918. Mamie grew up inside a household that, by all accounts, knew how to continue after a child's death. The furniture stayed polished. Meals continued. The house remained ready for visitors. That ability would matter later. Mamie had survived a childhood illness described as rheumatic fever. She was told she had a weak heart and instructed to rest 3 days each week. The diagnosis, as the Eisenhower Library presents it, shaped the term she was given. She negotiated the instruction down to remaining in bed until noon. Even as a girl, she was not easily governed by rules she considered excessive. Rest became a morning arrangement. The rest of the day belonged to her. She attended Miss Woodcott's, a private school in Denver, and graduated in 1915. She could play the piano. She could make a room feel like hers almost as soon as she entered it. By her own admission, she had never cooked a meal, made a bed, or handled money that had not already been given to her. Then she met the 2nd lieutenant from Abilene, Kansas. Eisenhower was earning about $140 a month and owed money on his uniforms. He pursued Mamie with determination, but not always with grace. He kept showing up. Her father eventually told her, by family recollection, to stop stringing the young man along. There were other suitors. On paper, Eisenhower was the least sensible choice. He had no money. His family did not possess the kind of social or financial standing the Dowds could offer him. His profession guaranteed that Mamie would spend her life following him to places she had not chosen. The Army was not yet the institution that would make him famous. It was an occupation built around movement, hierarchy, and sudden orders. A wife could turn a military post into a home, but she could never mistake the home for permanence. A household could be assembled in a few days and packed again within a week. A wife was expected to make quarters livable, host properly, support her husband's position, and leave without warning when the next assignment arrived. A commanding officer's opinion of a wife could matter to a husband's future. The woman at the post was not separate from the officer. She was part of the impression he made. John Dowd placed one condition on the marriage. Eisenhower would not enter the Army's aviation service. The danger was too great. Eisenhower had been genuinely interested in flying. By family account, he gave it up before the wedding on his future father-in-law's say-so. The exchange is undocumented in any surviving letter, but several Eisenhower biographers treat it as the working arrangement of the family. It was an early sign that the marriage would be shaped by forces larger than romance. Eisenhower's own condition was simpler and more absolute. Country first, Mamie second, always. By the family memory recorded by Susan Eisenhower in her biography of her grandmother, he told Mamie this before the wedding. Take it as family memory rather than as a document. It is the kind of phrase people remember because it was said plainly, not because it was written down. She is reported to have accepted it on the same terms. That sentence would remain true for decades. On Valentine's Day, February 14, 1916, he gave her a miniature of his West Point class ring, an amethyst set in gold. The engagement was formal. The gift was personal, but it also carried the mark of the institution that would define his life. He was offering her a version of himself already promised elsewhere. The wedding was moved forward. Trouble along the Mexican border pushed his orders ahead. What had been planned for November became July, and the original service was canceled. They married at 11 in the morning on July 1, 1916, in Mamie's parents' house in Denver. A small group of relatives gathered. A luncheon followed in the dining room. Her dress was bought off the rack because there had been no time. Eisenhower stood through the ceremony in a white dress uniform and reportedly refused to sit down for hours afterward because he did not want to wrinkle it. The story is told often enough that it has the feel of family lore, which is what most of the domestic texture of this marriage comes down to. The image is almost comic in its precision. a young officer worrying about a uniform while beginning a marriage. A bride in an off-the-rack dress inside a room she had known since childhood. A family already practiced in absorbing loss, gathered for the start of a new household. The wedding was not the beginning of uncertainty. It was the moment the uncertainty became public. Her father's house, her father's guests, her father's money paying for the luncheon, her father's veto already exercised over the groom's career, and the army setting the date because the army got a vote in this marriage from the first day and never gave it up. That same day, Eisenhower's promotion to first lieutenant came through. He was married and promoted on the same calendar date. The coincidence would later return with a different kind of weight. On July 1, 1916, a young couple entered a life together while the army confirmed the officer's advancement. The marriage and the career arrived together. From that point forward, they would be difficult to separate. The honeymoon took them to El Dorado Springs, Colorado, and then by train to Abilene. There, Mamie met the other half of the family. The Eisenhowers were plain people in a small white house with no money and a strict religious mother. Mamie, by every account, charmed them completely. She was good at rooms. That was her instrument, and it was a real one. Then they returned to San Antonio and moved into 2 rooms at Fort Sam Houston. The quarters were known to the officers' families as the Snake Ranch. The nickname has the ring of a later account of Army life. To Mamie, it was the first version of the home she would repeatedly build and then abandon, sometimes within a single season. She unpacked in 3 days, by her own later recollection. She learned the trick of making a temporary room feel settled. She learned to receive officers and their wives, to make conversation, to manage the small social expectations attached to rank. She discovered that her husband's standing depended partly on her, and she discovered, almost at once, that she was good at it. Her father's allowance continued for years. It helped support the household. It helped buy their first car. The money softened the practical edges of an officer's life, but it could not change the structure. By her own later estimate, she unpacked her household at least 27 times in 37 years. Other counts run past 30. The exact number is not in any official record. What is in the record is that the moves were constant. She also learned the cost of being left behind. Eisenhower was frequently absent. First on night patrols along the border, then on training assignments, then on more training assignments. Mamie's later account recalled the terror of finding herself alone on a strange post at night. There was no established household around her yet, no settled network of friends, no certainty that the place would become familiar before the next move. The marriage began inside a contradiction. Eisenhower wanted a woman who possessed spirit. He wanted someone who could make a life with him without allowing the army to erase her. Yet the life he could offer depended on her accepting the army's demands before the marriage had time to settle into anything ordinary. She chose him anyway. The choice was not unreasonable. It was simply larger than it appeared. A young woman in San Antonio, walking beside an officer on an inspection round, could not have known how many rooms she would eventually make feel like home. She could not know how many times she would leave one behind. But the bargain was already visible. Country first, Mamie second, always. And then, within a few years, the marriage encountered the loss that would define its private shape. After the wedding, the marriage became a sequence of departures. Mamie was 19 when she and Eisenhower settled into the 2 rooms at Fort Sam Houston, known as the Snake Ranch. She arrived with a husband, a new name, and almost no experience running a household. She could make a piano room sound musical. She could make a social gathering feel effortless. But she had never cooked a meal, made a bed, or managed money that had not been handed to her. The Army did not wait for her to become ready. At Fort Sam Houston, she learned to unpack a life in a matter of days. She learned to make military quarters look like a home. She learned that a wife's hospitality could matter to her husband's standing, and that a post could judge an officer through the quality of the life waiting behind his door. Then the orders came. Eisenhower was gone for night patrols, training assignments, and more training assignments. Mamie's early fear of being alone on a strange post at night became part of the marriage's routine. A husband's absence was not an interruption. It was one of the conditions under which the household operated. Consider what that meant in practice. A second lieutenant's pay in 1916 was roughly $140 a month, and Eisenhower still owed money on the uniforms he had been obliged to buy. Mamie's father, John Sheldon Dow, had made his money in meatpacking and retired at 36 as a semi-retired millionaire, which in 1906 was a genuinely unusual thing to be. He sent his daughter an allowance. The allowance bought their first car. The allowance kept the difference between an officer's wife and something considerably grimmer from becoming visible at the door. For the first 2 decades of the marriage, by most accounts, the standard of living was subsidized from Denver. Mamie always knew there was a house she could go back to, and a father who would pay for the ticket. That knowledge was going to matter more than once. On September 24, 1917, Mamie gave birth at the Post Infirmary at Fort Sam Houston. Their son was named Dwight Eisenhower. Mamie called him Little Ike. The name became Ike. Then it softened into Icky, the nickname that remained with him through the years, in which the family treated him as the child of the post. His father was in Georgia, training officer candidates. He would not meet his son for 3 months. He finally came home at Christmas on a 3-day pass, by one account because Mamie had pneumonia and someone decided that her illness qualified as an emergency. The family gathered around a child they had not yet learned how to approach. The following spring, Eisenhower was ordered to Camp Colt in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Mamie brought the baby north into an April snowstorm. Icky had a fever that turned out to be chickenpox. They moved 3 times in a few months while looking for housing. Camp Colt was a new tank training camp being built on the battlefield at Gettysburg. It was not a glamorous posting, and yet, by several accounts, it contained the happiest stretch the couple would share. Because for once, he was there. The child became part of the Army's landscape. Junior officers made him a miniature tank corps uniform. Eisenhower coached post football and took Icky to scrimmages. Later, at Camp Meade in Maryland, the same pattern reportedly continued. The boy was treated almost as camp property, a living link between the officer and the men he commanded. Eisenhower would later describe that period as one of the happiest of his life, by his own later recollection, and he was not a man who said such things casually. It is a happiness that cannot be separated from the life surrounding it. There were postings, moves, training grounds, uniforms, and the constant need to make a child fit into a world built for soldiers. Icky was loved. He was also carried through a marriage already governed by movement. At Christmas in 1920, a tricycle waited under the tree at Camp Meade. The family had recently hired a maid who had come through scarlet fever and was said to still be carrying it. Icky caught the illness just before Christmas. Mamie had a bad cold and was kept away from him. Camp doctors quarantined the boy and would not allow his father into the room. Eisenhower later wrote about sitting on the porch outside and waving through the glass. Occasionally, he was allowed to stand in the doorway and speak. The infection progressed to meningitis. It lasted 10 days. On January 2, 1921, Dwight Eisenhower died in his father's arms. He was 3 years old. The illness should not be turned into spectacle. It is enough to state what happened. The important fact is not the medical sequence, it is what followed. Icky was buried in Denver, in the Dowd family plot. Denver was the only permanent address either of them had. It was the address of her parents' square brick house on Lafayette Street, the address that had already absorbed the death of one of Mamie's sisters, Eleanor, in 1912, and would absorb another, Ida May, in 1918. The Dowd house had learned, by the time Mamie brought her own son's coffin home, how to keep the furniture polished around an empty place at the table. Eisenhower wrote about the death decades later in his memoir At Ease, published in 1967. He called it the greatest disappointment and disaster in my life, the one he had never been able to forget completely. But a memoir written nearly half a century later is not the same thing as a conversation that took place when the loss was new. Mamie said, late in life, that she and Eisenhower never talked about Icky in any meaningful way. She told her granddaughter Susan, "We never talked about it." That is the recollection that shapes the family's own understanding of what followed. That is the sentence that explains more than the roses. Because the marriage had already developed a method for surviving what it could not resolve. It did not necessarily solve the pain. It did not repair the absence. It preserved the appearance of order by allowing the most important subject to remain unspoken. The child's name was not erased. The memory was not treated as though it had never existed, but it was placed outside ordinary conversation, where the family could continue around it. The pattern of the marriage remained: postings, temporary rooms, departures, returns, another house to arrange, another household to pack. Mamie later estimated that she unpacked at least 27 times over 37 years. Other accounts give a higher number. The count matters because each move required a small act of reinvention. She had to make a place livable before the next order arrived. She had to make a room feel like hers, as she had done in San Antonio, and would do again in Panama, in Manila, in Washington, and in the White House. The skill that her Miss Walcott's schoolmistresses had refined in her, the instinct for making a room hold a particular kind of warmth, was now the instrument by which the marriage kept itself in one piece. But the loss was not discussed, because the family had learned to move while carrying what it could not name. Ike sent Mamie yellow roses every year on September 24th. By family recollection, yellow had been Icky's color. Eisenhower did this as a major at a dying-out army post. By the same accounts, he did it when he was supreme commander in Europe. He did it as President of the United States. The ritual did not explain itself. That may have been its purpose. It allowed the date to remain present without forcing the family to place the child inside a sentence. A bouquet could carry recognition when speech could not. There is one small trace in the wartime correspondence that suggests how difficult even the date was to handle. In a letter from September 1942, from summer 1942 until autumn 1945, Mamie lived in Washington while Eisenhower directed the largest military operation in human history. The private absence that had marked their life together became a public separation, visible to the entire country. And this time, the distance would not end with a return to San Antonio. The separation became official in the summer of 1942. Mamie lived in Washington. Eisenhower was in Europe, directing the largest military operation in human history. The same distance that had followed them through army posts now operated on a global scale. For roughly 3 years, they maintained a marriage through letters, controlled information, and one secret visit, and the physical setting on her side was not grand. After moves from Fort Sam Houston to Washington and to quarters at Fort Myer, Mamie received about a week's notice before another relocation. Naval officer Harry Butcher, who had grown close to the Eisenhowers in the Philippines, offered the use of an apartment at the Wardman Park, shared with his wife Ruth. Butcher was about to depart for sea duty himself, but the apartment remained available through the arrangement. So she spent the war in Washington in a borrowed apartment, living with another officer's wife while her husband commanded forces across the ocean. The precise floor and unit number are not part of the commonly cited record and should be treated as unestablished detail. Washington itself had changed since the early days of their marriage. The capital was swollen with war workers, federal agencies expanding overnight, military offices in converted hotels, and a social calendar dictated by rationing and travel restrictions. Officers' wives learned to navigate a city where every introduction carried a question about a husband overseas, and where official entertaining ran on ration books for sugar, butter, and meat. Mamie moved within that world, but largely outside its official social round, because her husband's position made her conspicuous in a way that other wives were not. The apartment was not a headquarters. It was a temporary home, but it became the center of her wartime work. Strangers wrote to her. Mothers, wives, and sisters asked whether she could help move a son away from a dangerous part of the front, find a missing man, or hurry a promotion. They were asking the Supreme Commander's wife to intervene in a system too large to answer them directly. The letters came in unfiltered, addressed simply to Mrs. Eisenhower in Washington, and they reached her because the Army mail system knew which box to forward them to. Mamie answered the letters personally. She could not move armies. She could not explain the progress of the war. She could read the appeals, answer what she could, and pass the rest along to a staff officer whose job was to triage them. The work placed her at the boundary between private grief and public power. People who had no access to Eisenhower could reach his wife. Whether she could help was another matter, but the fact that she answered gave the system a human point of contact. Other generals' wives did the same work, but the volume at the Eisenhower apartment was larger, because the man at the top of the chain drew every kind of request that could not find its way upward any other way. Reporters pursued her for comment, sent her gifts, and watched for any unguarded remark. She refused the gifts and gave the reporters nothing. In a city full of official statements and unofficial leaks, where columnists traded in unattributed detail and radio correspondents vied for any unguarded remark, she became the wall around the family's privacy. The discipline was not casual. Reporters who tried to approach her at church, at the apartment building, or through the butcher's social circle found that nothing came back. Whether the gifts and roses she refused took the specific form of jewelry and hats, as one version of the story has it, is part of the family memory rather than the documented record, presented as such. She also made one request of her own. Early in the war, Eisenhower dictated letters to her through a stenographer, the only practical method for a man buried under cables, conferences, and the daily demands of an Allied headquarters still being assembled. Mamie objected to receiving her husband's affection through an intermediary. According to family recollection, he began writing the letters by hand. The shift was small in form, but significant in what it acknowledged. She had told him, in effect, that a dictated letter was not a letter, and he had accepted the correction without argument. The transition from dictation to handwriting is part of the family tradition around these letters, not a date-stamped event in the archive. Carry it as memory. More than 300 wartime letters survive. They are the closest record available of what Eisenhower actually expressed to her during the separation. They are also carefully reassuring. Distance, danger, and public responsibility do not produce declarations of collapse. The letters present a man trying to steady the woman at home while carrying the burden of command. They are written in the idiom of a long army marriage, where affection travels inside practical sentences about health, weather, packages received, and the small news of friends at posts they both remembered. The surviving cache is the basis for the later book, Letters to Mamie, published by their son John. And the size of that book is one reason the wartime correspondence has shaped the public picture of the marriage so heavily. Two short phrases from the letters are widely quoted. In March 1943, Eisenhower wrote that through the publicity surrounding her, Mamie had been what he called sensible, considerate, and modest. On the night before D-Day, he wrote that he was well and loved her, in his words, as much as ever, all the time, day and night, and that he kept her photograph on his desk and in his bedroom. Those words are genuine, and they are the kind of declaration a man in his position could still make to his wife across an ocean. They do not settle every question about the marriage. They do something more limited and more revealing. They show the form in which affection could travel across the ocean when the person saying it was responsible for an invasion. The tone is the tone of a man managing his own morale as much as hers, because a commander who could not reassure his wife could not, by his own reasoning, be fully trusted with the larger task of reassuring a continent. Mamie saw Eisenhower once during the war, in a visit that the family tradition dates to early 1944, though the precise timing is part of memory rather than the archived record and should be carried as such. Even her friends could not be told that he was in Washington. The visit was concealed because any public confirmation that the Supreme Allied Commander had left the theater, even briefly, would have produced a cascade of strategic speculation. The secrecy was professional, not personal, but the effect on her was personal. She had to receive her own husband as if he were a stranger in the building, and to send him back as if the visit had not happened. She was living among the same newspapers everyone else read. The public could follow reports of her husband's movements, his staff, his schedule, and the people around him. She could not ask the country to turn the page when a rumor attached itself to one of those figures. The rumor had a name. The name was Kay Summersby. Summersby was a young woman from County Cork. She had driven ambulances through the Blitz, working the night runs in London while the bombers came, and she came out of that experience with a driver's nerve and an Anglo-Irish composure that American officers in London found unusual. In London, in 1942, she was assigned as Eisenhower's driver. She remained connected to him through North Africa, Britain, France, and Germany, which meant she crossed the same seas and lived in the same chain of headquarters as the man she drove. She rode in his car. She appeared in photographs near him. She learned bridge so she could join the table around him, a small social education that said more about the rhythms of an Allied headquarters than about any single hand of cards. At his request, she was eventually commissioned into the Women's Army Corps, a step that gave her an official status in the headquarters structure and that some of the staff noticed at the time. Whether Eisenhower requested the commission himself or merely endorsed an arrangement already in motion is a matter on which the surviving accounts differ. Treat it as a version, not a fact. Her fiancé, American officer Richard Arnold, was killed by a mine in North Africa in 1943. The loss was public enough to be reported, and it placed her in a category the headquarters understood well, a woman whose war had taken the man she had been waiting for. After Arnold's death, the surviving accounts place Summersby and Eisenhower in a closer working arrangement than before. The closeness is documented in the form of shared cars, shared meals, and shared travel. Whether anything beyond working closeness belonged to that arrangement is the question the public has never stopped asking. When the war ended, Eisenhower went to Washington. Summersby did not go with him. She was left behind. The separation was administrative as much as personal. Officers who had served under Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force were returned to their national services and reassigned. Her American ties ended at the water's edge. The first memoir, Eisenhower Was My Boss, appeared in 1948. It described a close working relationship and denied an affair. A second memoir, Past Forgetting, appeared in 1976 when Summersby was dying of cancer. It was written with a collaborator and released after her death. It claimed a love affair while also insisting that it was never fully consummated. The book arrived into a country that had already elected Eisenhower twice, that was 3 years past his presidency, and that had begun the process of looking back at the war with the long lens of memoir and television. Those two accounts cannot be treated as a simple pair of equal statements. They were written under different conditions, years apart, and they answered different needs. The first described the working relationship during the war and was shaped by the legal caution of a publisher and by Summersby's own continuing ties to people who had served at headquarters. The second presented a later account from a dying woman whose audience had shifted and whose reasons for speaking had shifted with it. The contradiction is part of the record, not a resolution. A reader who accepts both must also accept that Summersby changed her story, or that one of the two accounts was more guarded than the other, and neither possibility is closed by the documents that survive. Whatever the truth of the relationship, Past Forgetting is the book that placed the rumor in print as declaration rather than as gossip, and that is its real weight in the story. There is also the story attributed to Harry Truman. In Plain Speaking, published in 1974, Merle Miller reported that Truman had told him Eisenhower wrote to General George Marshall asking permission to divorce Mamie and marry Summersby. According to Miller, Marshall replied that he would bust Eisenhower out of the army and see to it that he never drew a peaceful breath again. The exchange, as printed, has the cadence of a political anecdote polished by repetition, and Truman had by then spent years in open dispute with Eisenhower over foreign policy and the conduct of the Korean War. The Marshall Papers contain no such letter. Marshall's biographers found nothing supporting it. Stephen Ambrose, who edited Eisenhower's papers, called the story completely untrue and noted that Truman had by then broken with Eisenhower politically. Robert Farrell, a scholar of Truman, concluded that there was almost no evidence beyond what Miller said appeared on tapes, and the existence and meaning of those tapes have been disputed. The pattern is familiar in Washington memoir publishing. A story told in conversation becomes, after enough retellings, a paragraph in a book, and the book becomes the citation for the story. This is a recollection reported by another person decades later. It is not a document that settles the question. There is a real letter, but it says something else. On June 4, 1945, a month after the German surrender, Eisenhower wrote to Marshall asking permission to bring Mamie to Europe. Marshall refused. The optics were impossible. A general's wife arriving while ordinary soldiers were still waiting to go home would have been unacceptable. The army was still processing embarkation, and a gesture of that kind would have traveled through the ranks as a sign that the leadership had lost its sense of proportion. The distinction is essential. The documented request concerned bringing Mamie to Europe. It did not request a divorce. The famous story of a letter to Marshall is not confirmed by the archive, and the one letter that is confirmed addresses a different question entirely. Another trace appears in Drew Pearson's published diary. It is a second-hand account from a staffer who spoke with Eisenhower in Paris in 1951. The account says Eisenhower had worried about what the public would make of the Summersby story and had been anxious that Mamie did not know he had considered a divorce. The entry was written down years after the conversation by a syndicated columnist whose business was the preservation of unattributed political material. Again, this is not a direct confession. It is a second-hand note, transmitted through another person and preserved in a political diary. It does not settle what happened. Susan Eisenhower has offered another reading. Mamie did not confide her worries about Summersby to her friends or parents, even though she told them almost everything else. Susan believes this suggests that Mamie was not especially worried. That is an interpretation, not a verdict. It is relevant because it comes from someone who knew the family and understood the patterns of Mamie's speech and silence. A woman who raised a single subject with her closest people would, by Susan's reading, have done the same with this one. The absence of that conversation is treated as evidence. It is also possible to read the absence differently, as the working of a woman who had long ago learned that certain subjects were not safe to raise in her own home. There is also the fact that Mamie had already spent much of her life accepting the limits of what could be said. She had married a man who placed country first. She had learned to move, wait, answer other people, and preserve the surface of a home. She had lost a child and discovered that the family could continue without discussing the loss. Against that background, a rumor could do its damage without requiring a single confirmed encounter. A story could live in the same room as the reassuring letters, because the letters did not address it and she did not raise it. The rumor did not need evidence to do its work. It needed only the absence of a denial. Whether Eisenhower and Summersby had an affair has never been established. No document in the record proves it. No document disproves it. The later memoirs disagree. Truman's recollection lacks documentary support. Pearson's diary is second-hand. Kay Summersby is dead and cannot answer the questions that continue to follow her name. The files that would settle the matter, if they exist, are not in the archive that scholars have been able to examine. The correct response is not to fill the gap with certainty, it is to leave the gap visible. Mamie could not answer the rumor in the way an accused person answers evidence. There was no document placed before her, no court, no formal list of witnesses, no statement requiring a response. The story existed in the same public atmosphere as the reassuring letters. It reached her through newspapers, photographs, social conversation, and the knowledge that other people were looking at her husband and deciding what his driver meant. She could refuse reporters. She could protect the family's privacy. She could answer appeals from strangers. She could write to the Supreme Commander and tell him to write back by hand. But she could not command the story to disappear. Stories of that order run on a logic that a private refusal cannot reach, because they require only that the named parties keep living in the public eye. As long as she appeared beside him, the rumor had somewhere to stand. The war ended and Eisenhower came home. He was not simply returning to the apartment at Wardman Park. He was returning as a national figure, with the machinery of a political future already beginning to form around him. Reporters who had watched the war from Washington now wanted the angle that would last through a campaign. Donors who had waited out the war were already sending signals. The country that had read his communiques from the continent now wanted to see the man at home. The country wanted a candidate. It wanted a couple. It wanted an image of stability after years of war. And Mamie had spent the war learning exactly how to help build one. The separation was ending. The public version was about to begin. When Eisenhower came home, he came home as a candidate. The war had made him famous. Now the country needed a simpler shape for his life. It needed a man who could lead, a woman who could stand beside him, and a marriage that appeared to have survived the pressures of separation and public scrutiny. The campaign supplied the image. Buttons read, "I like Ike." Others read, "I love Mamie." The slogans were not identical. One expressed approval of the general, the other expressed affection for the woman. Together, they presented a partnership that seemed both political and personal. Watch that distinction. The country was being asked to vote on two loyalties at once, and the buttons gave it a vocabulary for doing so. Volunteers handed them out at train stations and factory gates. Children wore them to school. The general's name and the wife's name moved through the country as a pair, printed in small circles of metal, and the pair became easier to repeat than to question. The country did not stop at admiration. It began watching her. Mamie had long been familiar with the consequences of being observed. As an army wife, she had learned to enter a new post, arrange a household, meet the people around her husband, and make the setting work. The skill was transferable. Now the setting was national. Every detail could become evidence of something larger. A hat, a glove, the way she gripped a railing, the way she stepped off a plane. Each of these was being recorded by photographers who worked for papers that wanted a single clear image on the front page. The army posts had been small, and the mistakes could be absorbed. The country would not absorb anything. Sometimes she staggered in public. She held on to railings. A photograph caught her gripping the side of a plane as she descended the stairs, one hand flat on the metal, her weight uneven, her face set in concentration rather than embarrassment. Washington concluded that the First Lady was drunk. The explanation followed her for years. It was treated as a joke and repeated with the confidence of people who believed they had seen proof. Columnists used it. Late-night hosts used it. People at dinner tables used it. The joke had the useful property of being repeatable in a sentence, and the sentence did not require the speaker to know anything about her. But there is no evidence that Mamie had a drinking problem. She drank at parties as people of her generation did, in the way that social life in 1950s Washington assumed. The more serious explanation was medical. Meniere's disease, an inner ear disorder said to affect her balance, has been the explanation historians have most often offered, alongside references to other conditions of the inner ear and sinus. The source material tells the story this way: whether every diagnosis that has been attached to her over the years rests on firm documentation is harder to settle from outside her medical records. The point that can be made firmly is that the public preferred the joke for decades, while the medical reading, taken seriously by the physicians who actually examined her, explained the very specific circumstances in which she faltered. Descending, turning, walking in low light, stepping off moving platforms. The joke could not accommodate that detail. The joke needed her to be careless in order to be funny. The country preferred the joke because jokes are easier to repeat than diagnoses. A woman falling in public could be turned into a character. A medical condition asked the audience to confront uncertainty. Uncertainty required the audience to feel something closer to pity, and pity was harder to package than laughter. So the laughter persisted, and Mamie learned to manage the cost. Mamie reduced her public appearances so that she would be seen less often and Eisenhower would be embarrassed less, at least according to the received version of the story. The precise extent to which she and the White House staff deliberately rationed her appearances is family recollection and memoir, not a documented order. She declined invitations she would once have accepted. She limited her travel. She chose events where she could be seated, where the choreography did not require her to descend anything in view of cameras. That was the working response to the public gaze. It was not surrender exactly, but it was a narrowing of her own life. Each refusal cost her a room she might have shaped, a contact she might have made, a piece of influence that came from being seen and being gracious in the seeing. She paid that price quietly, and the bill was never itemized for the public. The bed tells a different story. As a girl in Denver, she had been told to rest 3 days a week because of a weak heart left by a childhood bout of rheumatic fever, in the family account the Eisenhower Library preserves. She negotiated the instruction down to remaining in bed until noon. In the White House, she woke early and took breakfast on a tray. By mid-morning, she had already worked through the day's menus, the guest list, the seating arrangements, the flowers, the staff assignments, and the budget. The papers on the tray had been reviewed before the first cup was poured. The day began with a list, and the list had been finished in another woman's bedroom hours before the working staff arrived at their desks on the ground floor. The bed was not retreat, it was an office. Mamie ran the White House household with exacting precision. She understood that the visible life of a presidency depends on thousands of details that most people never see. A menu had to be decided. A guest list had to be balanced between political allies, old friends, donors, foreign diplomats, and the officers who had served with Eisenhower and now wanted to see the rooms they had only read about. Flowers had to be placed in rooms where the cameras would catch them. Staff members had to know what was expected of them and what would happen if it was not done. Expenditure had to be controlled because the household budget came from congressional appropriation, and any excess became a story. J.B. West, the chief usher who had served Eleanor Roosevelt and would later serve Jacqueline Kennedy, described Mamie as the most exacting employer he had worked for in the executive residence. The judgment was admiring. She gave orders in a pleasant voice and expected them to be followed exactly. She held near total control of household spending and clipped coupons for the staff to use, an economy that looked eccentric from the outside and read as discipline from the inside. The chief usher's assessment matters because it comes from the machinery around her. He had seen the White House under 3 very different first ladies, each with a different set of expectations and a different way of organizing the rooms. He knew the difference between a household that was being decorated and a household that was being administered. Mamie's household was being administered, and the administration held. The country saw the smile in pink. It did not always see the administrative mind behind the smile. The pink dress at the inauguration, the matching hat, the careful hair, the small wave, these were the images that traveled, and they were the images the cameras were built to capture. What did not travel was the order book on the breakfast tray, the telephone calls to the kitchen before 7 in the morning, the seating chart that had been reworked 3 times because a senator's wife had taken offense at being placed below a general's wife. That work happened out of frame, and the woman who did it was not in the photograph. The image was assembled from real things. Mamie was warm. Eisenhower was devoted. The marriage had endured extraordinary separation. The household ran because she ran it. But the public version arranged those truths around a single idea, the perfect couple. Perfection, however, does not tolerate instability. The image had no place for a wife who gripped a railing. No place for a husband who had spent 3 years on another continent. No place for a first son whose name was not spoken. The image required steadiness, and steadiness had to be performed, and performance was Mamie's job. On September 24, 1955, the date returned in a house that already carried the history of the marriage. The house was 750 Lafayette Street in Denver, the same house where Ike and Mamie had married in 1916. It belonged to her mother. The address had been part of the family's fixed geography, while the rest of their lives moved from post to post. The wedding had been held in the dining room. The lunches had been served from the kitchen. The dowd money had paid for the dress and the small reception. Now the same rooms held a different ceremony. A president of the United States in a bed upstairs, with chest pain that nobody in the household yet knew how to read. Eisenhower had played golf at Cherry Hills the day before. He had complained about a hamburger with onions at dinner, the kind of domestic complaint that would be filed away by the staff as ordinary and would later be quoted in histories as the last meal of a man who nearly died. He went to bed early. The early bedtime was not unusual. The schedule of a presidential campaign stop in a western city was punishing, and the body he had carried through the war was now 65 years old, under the kind of stress that a heart cannot negotiate with. Around 2 in the morning, Mamie called Dr. Howard Snyder, as the family story goes. The precise sequence of who summoned whom and at what hour is preserved chiefly in the doctor's and aide's own later recollections. He came from wherever he was staying nearby, crossed the lawn, entered the house, and gave Eisenhower morphine, allowing him to sleep. Morphine was the standard response of a physician who arrived at 2 a.m. and found a patient in pain whose diagnosis was not yet clear. It was also a decision that would later be criticized because morphine can mask the symptoms that an electrocardiograph is meant to read. Hours passed before an electrocardiograph machine was brought from Fitzsimons Army Hospital, ferried across Denver in the small hours, plugged in, applied. The reading confirmed a massive heart attack. The delay between the first symptom and the first diagnostic reading has been picked over by historians ever since, and it is fair to say that no one involved came out of the picking looking like a hero. The date was also Icky's birthday. Nobody in the family said that out loud. The boy had been dead for 34 years. The yellow roses still came every September 24th, ordered by a man who did not say why and received by a woman who did not ask. On this particular September 24th, the roses were not the only thing arriving at the house on Lafayette Street. The electrocardiograph had arrived. The morphine had arrived. The news had arrived that the President of the United States had a heart that might fail, in a house that already held the silence around a smaller heart that had failed. The two events sat in the same calendar square, and the family treated them the way they had always treated Icky's birthday, by not saying. Mamie moved into the room adjoining his at Fitzsimons Army Hospital and stayed for the duration of his recovery in the family's account of those weeks. The hospital sat on the edge of Denver, and the room Mamie occupied became the most controlled space in the executive branch. By her own arrangement and the staff's deference to it, she decided who could enter. Visitors were rationed, calls were limited, reporters were kept at a distance negotiated in advance. Cabinet officers were admitted by appointment. Foreign leaders were received in the formal receiving room of the hospital, not at the bedside. For several weeks, the access point to the President of the United States was his wife. She had been told in 1916 that country came first. For decades, the country had come first. In that hospital, the country reached Eisenhower through Mamie. Every minister who wanted a decision went through her doorway first. Every ally who wanted a word went through her doorway first. Every reporter who wanted a photograph went through her doorway first. The arrangement of the marriage, which had been built around the principle that his duty preceded her preferences, now required that her preferences precede the country's access to him. The reversal was not declared. It simply happened, because the country could not function while the president recovered, and the president could not recover while the country was allowed to disturb him. He recovered. He ran again the following year, and won by a larger margin than before. The heart attack, which could plausibly have ended a candidacy in the political climate of 1956, did not. Mamie's management of the hospital room had made the recovery possible, and the recovery made the second term possible. The country rewarded her work without quite knowing whose work it had rewarded. Several years later, in November 1957, he suffered a stroke, with abdominal surgery in between the two events, a sequence that medical historians have since reconstructed from the doctor's own published account. Each time, the sick room returned, Mamie beside it. The family's private life became a government concern, and she became the person who determined what the government could see. The pattern repeated so consistently that by the time of the stroke, the White House staff understood that the First Lady's authority over the President's medical care was not a temporary arrangement, but a permanent feature of the administration. Doctors briefed her before they briefed the press. Staff cleared schedules through her before they cleared them through the Chief of Staff. The office she ran from the bed was now running the country's most sensitive conversations. There is a temptation to describe this as influence. It was more practical than that. She controlled access, she managed the household, she decided who could enter and how long they could stay. The machinery of presidential illness depended on her judgment, and her judgment was the judgment of a woman who had been running households and the people inside them for 40 years. In 1950, before the heart attack, they bought a farm at Gettysburg, adjoining the battlefield where Eisenhower had trained tank crews in 1918, so the family remembers. The exact date of the purchase and the precise phrasing of the decision belong to memoir. It was the first house either of them had ever owned. Mamie chose it and decorated it. The purchase was a small, late, and significant fact about a marriage that had spent its first 3 decades living in quarters assigned by the Army. The farm broke the pattern. The address was theirs, the way no previous address had been theirs. After they left the White House in 1961, they went there. The farm became hers in a way no previous address had been. Fort Sam Houston had been assigned quarters. The Snake Ranch had been temporary. The Wardman Park apartment had been borrowed. The White House had belonged to the presidency. The farm was a place they had chosen. She made the rooms. She arranged the furniture. She managed the staff the way she had managed the executive residence staff. And the Gettysburg neighbors learned what Washington had learned, that the woman who had been dismissed as a figure in pink ran her houses with the discipline of a quartermaster. Mamie's authority had developed quietly, inside a system designed to make the First Lady visible but not fully independent. She was judged for how she appeared, then criticized when her appearance seemed unsteady. She was asked to embody warmth, then mocked when her body did not conform to the expected image. She was held up as the proof of a happy marriage, then held responsible for the parts of the marriage that the public had been told did not exist. Yet the household records show what the jokes concealed. She was exacting, capable, and essential. J.B. West's assessment matters because it comes from the machinery around her. He had seen the White House under Eleanor Roosevelt, Mamie Eisenhower, and Jacqueline Kennedy. He knew the difference between decoration and administration. He had watched 3 first ladies handle the same building, the same staff, the same budget, and the same unforgiving public eye. He had reached a conclusion, and he wrote it down. Mamie understood both. The campaign had turned the marriage into a product. The buttons simplified it. The photographs stabilized it. The jokes tried to diminish it. The hospital tested the parts that remained after the slogans were removed. What the hospital revealed was that the woman the country had been laughing at was the woman the country had been relying on, and the reliance had been hidden behind the laughter. And when the country finally had to come through her to reach the president, the arrangement was no longer simply country first, Mamie second. The country had to pass through Mamie first. Eisenhower died in March 1969. Mamie lived for another 10 years, until 1979. The public marriage had already entered its final phase, the phase in which families decide what the world will be allowed to remember. She had the letters. More than 300 wartime letters from Eisenhower to Mamie, written by hand after she objected, by family account, to receiving his affection through a stenographer. They were a record of reassurance, affection, distance, and the effort to keep a marriage visible while the couple lived under extraordinary pressure. They were also selective. In 1978, 2 years after Kay Summersby's Past Forgetting appeared in bookshops, their son John published Letters to Mamie. The book gathered hundreds of Eisenhower's wartime letters, with commentary by John. The timing was, by all accounts, not subtle. By several readings of the family, the book was, among other things, a response. It placed the husband's voice beside the rumor. It showed a man writing home with affection, describing Mamie in warm terms, declaring that he loved her as much as ever, all the time, day and night. The letters were not fabricated. The book's warmth was not invented. But publication is never the same thing as surrendering the whole record. The manuscript materials went to the Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene in April 1978. The library's own finding aid notes that, in some cases, multiple paragraphs were removed from the published versions of the letters, with the stated reason being personal privacy. There are standing restrictions on material that would constitute an unwarranted invasion of personal privacy or that might affect living persons. One letter is recorded as having been left out entirely, a letter from the night before D-Day. By family and library accounts, John did not include it in Letters to Mamie. It remained with the family, was sold decades later, and eventually appeared in a public auction in 2019, after Mamie's lifetime and after John's. The omission is not proof of concealment. It is proof that a family record is built through choices. A letter can be authentic and still remain outside the volume intended to represent the relationship. Mamie's letters to Eisenhower do not survive in anything like the same published form. The public has his voice describing her, selected by their son. Her side of the correspondence is not presented in a comparable collection. But Mamie did leave a record of her own. She gave the Eisenhower Presidential Library an oral history that ran, by the library's count, to 178 pages. It covered, by her own description to interviewers, the wedding, the early postings, Panama, the Washington years, her equilibrium problems, her worries about the president's health, and her philosophy regarding Ike. The finding aid records that the family reviewed the oral history. She sat for interviews. She chose which stories to repeat. She repeated them, and those stories became part of the public record. That is the hidden labor of preserving a marriage. It is not only the writing of letters. It is the decision to speak, the decision to omit, the decision to make a room calm when the family has absorbed something it cannot name. Mamie had learned this work in Denver. In the house at 750 Lafayette Street, she had grown up among polished furniture and early losses. She had learned how to make a room feel like hers. She had learned how a house continued after a child died. She had absorbed a family's method for protecting its members by carrying grief without turning it into a public explanation. She applied the same discipline to the White House. Menus, flowers, guest lists, staff assignments, budgets, and access. The details were not trivial. They were how a household remained steady when the president's health became a national concern. In 1961, after the inauguration of the next president, she cleaned out the Lafayette Street house. It was sold. The contents were donated in parts to the Colorado Republican Party for a fundraising auction and to a local historical society. A house can preserve a marriage only until someone decides to empty it. John's public position on the Summersby question was direct. He said, by several published accounts, that only 2 people knew the truth, and both were dead. That statement does not settle the question. It identifies its limit. The wartime relationship between Eisenhower and Kay Summersby has never been documented as an affair. Summersby's first memoir, Eisenhower Was My Boss, described a close working relationship and denied an affair. Her later book, Past Forgetting, by her own telling, claimed a love affair while saying it was never fully consummated. Harry Truman's recollection about a letter to General George Marshall rests in the historical record on Truman's memory decades after the fact, and historians treat it with heavy skepticism. Drew Pearson's diary contains a second-hand account of uncertain origin. No document proves the rumor true, and no document proves it false. The absence of proof is not the same as the absence of an event. It is simply the condition under which the story survives.
John's answer recognizes the problem. He does not pretend to know what only 2 people could know. He places the question beyond the reach of the surviving record. And Kay Summersby is dead. She cannot answer for herself, and this film will not answer for her. The family's own losses were handled differently.
Dowd. Dwight Eisenhower's remains were moved from the Denver family plot to the small chapel at the Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene during the 1960s. Eisenhower was buried there in 1969. Mamie joined them in 1979. By family and library accounts, the places changed. The arrangement remained. A child, a husband, and a wife gathered in the same final setting. The public record has a preferred image: the inauguration, the kiss, Mamie in pink, the buttons that promised affection and approval. The kiss was real. The affection inside the frame was real. Eisenhower's letters contain real declarations. Mamie's command of the White House household was real. Her balance problems were real. The roses were real. The separations were real. The frame was still incomplete. It left out Denver, where her family's money had helped sustain the marriage while Eisenhower's career was still beginning. It left out the promotion that arrived on the same day as the wedding. It left out the child whose birthday the couple could not discuss. It left out 3 years in which Mamie lived in a borrowed apartment answering letters from strangers. It left out a rumor she could not answer with evidence. It left out the medical explanation for a condition turned into a joke. It left out the bed in which she ran a presidential household. It left out an oral history reviewed by the family before the public heard it. It left out a letter from the night before D-Day that the family chose not to publish. Every part of the public version was true. That is why it worked. The version survived because it was assembled from true things by people who knew exactly which ones to leave out. Eisenhower commanded armies. Mamie commanded the version that allowed the household to continue. He sent the roses, she kept the letters. The roses became a ritual visible from the outside. The letters became the material from which a son built a book. But the letters were not neutral. They were selected, arranged, and edited by family and by institution. The final record was not simply something the family possessed. It was something the family shaped. The record of the marriage is therefore not a secret document waiting to be opened. It is a series of decisions. What to say, what not to say, what to publish, what to omit, what to repeat until strangers believe it has always been there. The inauguration photograph is still real. Mamie is still wearing pink. The kiss still happened. But if you look long enough, the frame begins to show the shape of everything it has excluded.